James had always considered himself a rational man. Life, for him, followed a predictable rhythm: early mornings, late nights, and an ever-present sense of monotony. His one-bedroom apartment reflected his personality: neatly kept, unremarkable, and entirely solitary. Yet that first call shattered his carefully constructed routine. The shrill ring of his phone pierced the silence at exactly 3:13 a.m. Disoriented, James fumbled for his phone, squinting at the screen. The display read "unknown number." Half asleep, he answered, muttering a groggy hello. On the other end, a faint crackle of static filled the void, interrupted by the faint, trembling plea of a voice he couldn't quite place. The words were indistinct, yet unmistakably desperate. James hung up, his heart racing. He stared at the device, willing it to remain silent, and tried to rationalize what had just happened. It had to be a prank, a misdial, or perhaps some glitch. Still, as he lay in bed, staring at the faint glow of the streetlights creeping through his blinds, unease settled over him like a heavy blanket. Morning brought a semblance of normalcy. The call felt distant, almost forgettable, amidst the grind of emails and spreadsheets. But deep down, James knew the night wasn't over. The second call came the following night, and then the night after that. Each time, James awoke to the same shrill ring, the same unknown number, and the same voice, clearer now, pleading for help, imploring him to listen. He found himself dreading the inevitability of 3:13 a.m., the sound of the ringtone burrowing into his mind long before it arrived. His attempts to block the number were futile. The calls persisted, bypassing every safeguard he set. Worse, his phone began acting strangely during the day. Brief bursts of static during conversations, apps freezing inexplicably, and the screen flickering as though struggling to hold on to reality. James's co-workers noticed his deteriorating appearance. Someone suggested he take a day off, but James dismissed it. What could he say? That his nights were haunted by a phantom voice and an unrelenting ringtone? Instead, he buried himself in work, hoping exhaustion would drown out the fear. Ignoring the calls seemed to escalate the situation. One night, as the ringtone blared, James refused to answer. He silenced his phone, burying it under a pillow and pressing his hands against his ears. Yet the sound persisted, not from his phone but from everywhere, reverberating through the walls, the floor, and even the air around him. Then came the hallucinations. Shadows crept across his apartment, moving with an unnatural, jerking rhythm. The edges of his vision blurred, and he caught glimpses of figures that dissolved when he turned to face them. Mirrors reflected faces that weren't his own, pale and distorted, their mouths moving in silent screams. Days became unbearable. The hallucinations followed him, bleeding into his waking hours. James began avoiding reflective surfaces and crowded spaces, terrified of the figures that seemed to linger just beyond his sight. Searching for answers, he stumbled upon a thread buried deep within an online forum, a scattered collection of posts about cursed calls and warnings to never answer. James found himself reading and rereading the posts, each one detailing a similar pattern: the calls, the voices, the hallucinations. One user's story mirrored his own, right down to the static and shadows. The final post warned that answering the call would lead to a truth no one could bear. The next night, James couldn't resist. When the phone rang, he answered, bracing himself for the static and the voice. But this time, the voice was different. It was calm, almost grateful, as it told him he had taken the first step. It gave him an address, a warehouse on the outskirts of town, and urged him to come. By day, the warehouse was unremarkable, a crumbling relic of a forgotten era. Inside, James found scorch marks on the walls and graffiti warning to stay away. As he wandered deeper, he discovered an old rotary phone sitting on a rusted table. When it began ringing, James recoiled, unable to bring himself to pick up. He fled, the air in the warehouse heavy with a malevolence he couldn't explain. Each night grew worse. The hallucinations became vivid and violent, the shadows clawing at James's walls and ceiling, their whispers growing louder, almost accusatory. Clocks in his apartment stopped at 3:13, their hands trembling as if straining to move forward. James spent hours on the forum, combing through every fragment of information. The user who shared his experiences had gone silent. their account abandoned. But their last message echoed in James's mind. The truth devours. The voice on the calls was relentless, begging him to finish what he started, and claiming that he alone could end the suffering. James became consumed by the idea that the warehouse held the answers. Despite his terror, he knew he had to return. James returned to the warehouse at 3:13 a.m. The rotary phone began ringing as he stepped inside, the sound reverberating through the empty space. With trembling hands he answered, and the voice told him the truth. Decades ago, a fire had consumed the warehouse, killing dozens trapped inside. Negligence had sealed their fate, and their spirits were left to linger, their anguish tied to the phone. James's family, it turned out, had been responsible for the fire, their greed cutting corners on safety. The voice revealed that James was the last surviving member of that family, and his bloodline carried the weight of their guilt. As the voice spoke, the warehouse began to shift. The walls blackened, the air grew cold, and the shadows coalesced into shapes, faces twisted in agony, hands reaching toward him. James's final moments in the warehouse were a blur. The phone remained in his hand as the shadows closed in, pulling him into their world. When he opened his eyes, he found himself in a void, the space around him a swirling mass of static and darkness. The phone in his hand began to ring. On the other end, he heard a familiar sound, a desperate, trembling voice begging for help. It took James a moment to realize it was his own voice, distorted and broken. He was now part of the cycle, the voice on the other end of the line, trapped between worlds and bound to the phone. As the void around him pulsed with the sound of ringing, James understood the horrifying truth. He was the curse now, forever calling others to share his fate.